The grand ballroom of the Lotte World Tower had never felt so cold, despite the hundreds of bodies packed within its gold-leafed walls. Madeline Hayes pressed herself into the velvet curtains of the mezzanine gallery, her fingers trembling against the railing as she watched the Dragon Syndicate's power players move below like sharks in silk suits. Thousands of crystal shards in the chandeliers caught the neon glow of the Seoul skyline outside, casting jagged light across the faces of rival bosses and corrupt politicians who had gathered to witness this moment. The merger. She should have stayed in the safe house. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to disappear into the rain-slicked alleys of Gangnam where she had waited for 3 days for a single encrypted text from Min-Jae. But he had sent nothing. No warning, no heartbeat of reassurance, only a deafening, icy silence. And so she had come to see the execution of her own heart. Park Min-Jae stood on the marble dais at the far end of the hall, his silhouette sharp and predatory in a custom black tuxedo. Even from the height of the gallery, Madeline could feel the sheer gravity of his presence. The rigid set of his shoulders, the lethal edge of his jawline, the cold, obsidian stare that forced the most dangerous men in Asia to incline their heads in silent, terrified respect. For 12 months she had known the man beneath the monster. The man who had traced the line of her throat as if she were made of glass. The man whose voice turned thick and raw when he whispered her name in the privacy of his penthouse. The man who had placed a heavy, diamond-encrusted dragon pendant around her neck and sworn she was the only soul he would ever answer to. When the war with the Vanthorns is over, he had promised, his breath ghosting against her ear as they watched the city lights. I will seat you on the throne beside me. You won't be a secret anymore, Madeline. You will be the Syndicate's queen. She had believed him. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, where the early secret of his heir lay hidden. A secret she was now realizing she would have to protect from the very man who had fathered it. Suddenly the music died. Min-Jae reached out a hand but not toward the stairs where Madeline stood. He reached for the woman standing to his right, the heiress of the Vanthorn Clan. As he raised their joined hands to the crowd, Madeline felt her soul shatter. He didn't look up. He didn't look for her. He simply stepped into his new life, leaving her in the shadows to die. The silence following Min-Jae's announcement was more deafening than the applause that followed. From her perch in the shadows, Madeline felt the world tilt. The diamond pendant around her neck, the one he had fastened with a promise of forever, now felt like a branding iron, searing her skin with the heat of his betrayal. Below, Min-Jae leaned in to whisper something to the Vanthorn heiress. He didn't look like a man under duress. He looked like a king claiming his prize. Madeline's hand instinctively covered her abdomen, a cold shiver of terror racing through her. This wasn't just a broken heart, it was a death sentence. She turned to slip away, to vanish into the rain before the reality of his choice could swallow her whole, but the exit was already blocked. 2 men in charcoal suits, their faces as expressionless as stone, stepped from the velvet shadows of the mezzanine. They were Min-Jae's personal cleaners, men she had shared coffee with in the penthouse kitchen while waiting for Min-Jae to return from late-night meetings. Miss Hayes, the taller one, Kale said. His voice was devoid of the warmth he had shown her only a week ago. The boss has requested that we escort you from the premises. Escort me where, Kale? Madeline's voice was a fragile thread. To the penthouse? Or to the harbor? Kale didn't answer. He simply reached out, his hand wrapping firmly around her upper arm. The grip was a clear indication that she was no longer the protected consort of the Dragon Syndicate. She was a loose end being tucked away. As they marched her toward the service elevator, Madeline threw one last look over the railing. At that exact moment, Min-Jae turned his head. For a heartbeat, his obsidian eyes locked onto hers. There was no flicker of regret, no secret signal of a plan, only a flat, icy void that confirmed everything. He watched her being led away by his executioners as if she were a piece of trash being cleared from his ballroom floor. The elevator doors hissed shut, cutting off the celebratory music and the light of the chandeliers. In the sudden claustrophobic dimness, the metallic scent of gun oil filled the small space. Madeline realized then that the escort wasn't taking her home. Min-Jae had traded her life for an empire, and as the elevator descended toward the darkness of the parking garage, she knew the man who had called her his soulmate was gone. In his place was a monster who had just signed her death warrant. Outside, the Seoul rain began to pour, washing away the last traces of the woman she used to be. The phoenix was about to be born, but first Madeline Hayes had to die. The descent in the elevator had been a prelude to a nightmare. The parking garage was a tomb of concrete and flickering fluorescent light, where the muffled sound of the gala above felt like the heartbeat of a ghost. Kale and the other man didn't speak as they forced Madeline into the back of a black sedan. The child locks clicked into place with a mechanical finality that sounded like a casket closing. As the car sped away, she watched the Lotte World Tower shrink in the distance, the neon lights of the penthouse where she had once felt safe now looking like cold, distant stars. They drove toward the Han River, the city blurring into long, jagged streaks of blue and red through the rain-streaked windows. When the car finally skidded to a halt on the edge of a darkened, industrial pier, Madeline didn't beg. She knew the protocol of the Dragon Syndicate. Loose ends weren't argued with, they were severed. A single, heavy blow to the back of her head sent the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray and red. She felt the bite of the midnight wind, the brief, terrifying sensation of weightlessness, and then the bone-chilling impact of the river. The water was a predator, filling her lungs and dragging her toward the silt-covered bottom. But as the darkness closed in and her consciousness began to flicker, a beam of white light cut through the murky depths. Strong, gloved hands seized her, hauling her upward until her head broke the surface. She retched up the river's brine as she was pulled onto the deck of a sleek, silent vessel. A man stood over her, his silhouette etched against the glowing Seoul skyline. On his finger, a signet ring caught the light, a golden phoenix rising from flames. This was the rival, the man Min-Jae had spent years trying to destroy. Park Min-Jae is a fool, the man said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that cut through the sound of the rain. He throws away diamonds and expects them not to shine for someone else. Rest now, Madeline. The dragon thinks you are dead. The phoenix will make sure you are reborn. She was taken to a secure medical facility, a place of sterile white light and soft-footed guards. 4 days she drifted in a feverish haze. On the third morning, a doctor with the phoenix emblem on her lapel sat by her bed. The internal bruising is healing, the doctor said softly. But we must discuss your care. Your body has been through an immense trauma, and we need to be careful for the sake of the life you're carrying. Madeline's heart stopped. What? You're nearly 10 weeks pregnant, the doctor confirmed. With twins. They are stable, Madeline. They are fighters. Twins. Min-Jae's heirs were alive inside her, protected by his greatest enemies. Madeline looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The girl who had loved the Dragon King had drowned in the river. In her place, a cold, fierce heat began to burn. She would take the Phoenix's power. She would become their weapon. And one day she would make Min-Jae realize that the soulmate he discarded was the only thing that could have saved his empire. 3 months had transformed the shimmering skyline of Seoul into a jagged landscape of fear. The rain that night had never truly seemed to stop. It merely settled into a permanent, oppressive mist that clung to the neon signs of Gangnam like a shroud. Park Min-Jae had become a ghost haunting his own empire, a man hollowed out by a realization that had come far too late. The grand merger he had traded his soul for was a hollow victory, a throne of ash built on the lie of a drugged betrayal. Once he had cleared the fog of the Vanthorn's wolfsbane-laced wine, the vacuum left by Madeline's absence had sucked the humanity right out of him. The Dragon Syndicate was no longer a business. It was a war machine. Min-Jae had turned the city into a hunting ground, his black sedans prowling the streets at all hours. He slept in 2-hour bursts, his eyes permanently bloodshot, his knuckles bruised from the desperate interrogations he conducted himself in the bowels of the Lotte World Tower. He wasn't looking for a rival, he was looking for a miracle. He had executed 3 of his own high-ranking captains in a single week. Men who had been present the night Madeline disappeared, men who had looked the other way while she was led to the elevator. To the rest of the underworld, he was a mad king, a feral beast tearing apart his own territory in a frantic, bloody search for a ghost. Rumors whispered through the back alleys that the boss had lost his mind, that he spoke to the empty chair in his office and clutched a crushed diamond pendant until his palms bled. Every port was under blockade, every CCTV camera in the city was being scrubbed by his hackers. And yet the river had remained silent. Madeline Hayes was gone, erased by the very hands he had commanded. He had burned the world to keep his throne, only to find that without her the throne was a tomb. Deep within the fortified compound of the Phoenix Syndicate, Madeline watched the flickering news reports of the chaos on a wall of monitors. She stood with a poise that was entirely new, her silhouette sharp and lethal. The soft girl who had wept in the mezzanine gallery was buried under layers of scars and cold, calculated rage. She watched the man she had once called her soulmate execute a traitor on live television, his face a mask of primal grief. She felt nothing. Her hand rested on her growing swell, the only part of her that still felt warm. Min-Jae was tearing the city apart to find a memory, but Madeline was building a future that would eventually come for his neck. In the City of Shadows, the dragon was screaming for mercy, unaware that the phoenix was already sharpening the blade. The transition from prey to predator was completed not in a moment of epiphany, but in the cold, rhythmic clicking of a silver revolver being loaded in the dark. Madeline stood in the belly of a silent transport van, her face painted with tactical shadows, her long hair braided tight against her skull. On her chest, the golden phoenix emblem felt heavy, a badge of a new life bought with the death of her innocence. Across from her, the phoenix enforcers sat in grim silence, waiting for her command. She was no longer the girl who hid in velvet curtains. She was the ghost that Min-Jae had created, finally coming home to haunt him. The Dragon Syndicate warehouse on the outskirts of Incheon was a fortress of corrugated steel and high-frequency sensors, but Madeline knew its blind spots better than the men guarding it. She had walked these aisles at Min-Jae's side when he had proudly shown her his logistics empire. Now she moved through the perimeter fence like a blade through silk. With a sharp, silent signal, her team moved. The air was suddenly filled with the hiss of suppressed gunfire and the rhythmic thud of bodies hitting concrete. Madeline moved with a terrifying, fluid precision. She didn't flinch when the glass shattered or when the alarms finally began their shrill, panicked scream. She made her way to the central office, the high-security vault where Min-Jae kept his most sensitive ledgers. With the practiced ease of someone who had once held the keys to his heart, she bypassed the biometric locks. Her team began the rapid extraction of data, but Madeline had a different objective. She walked to the heavy mahogany desk where a framed photo of a younger, smiling Min-Jae sat. She didn't look at it. Instead, she reached into her tactical vest and pulled out an object wrapped in black silk. She unwound it, revealing the diamond-encrusted dragon pendant. The light caught the stones, making them flash with a cold, mocking brilliance. This was the piece of jewelry he had crushed under his heel the night of the gala, the piece his cleaners were supposed to have thrown into the river with her body. She placed the pendant directly in the center of the desk, right atop the Ledger of Souls. It was a calling card and a declaration of war. It was the physical manifestation of his biggest mistake, polished and returned to him like a poisoned gift. By the time the dragon's backup arrived, the warehouse was a smoking ruin of deleted servers and neutralized guards. Madeline was already back in the shadows, the adrenaline hum in her veins the only thing keeping the chill of the night at bay. She knew that within the hour Min-Jae would be standing in that room. He would see the diamond dragon and he would realize that the ghost he was hunting wasn't just alive. She was coming for everything he loved. The first strike was landed not on his flesh but on his sanity. The hunt had officially reversed. Park Min-Jae arrived at the Incheon warehouse long before the smoke had cleared, his presence heralded by the screech of tires and the panicked scattering of his remaining guards. He stepped out into the rain, his overcoat snapping in the wind, his eyes scanning the ruin of his most secure facility with a cold, terrifying detachment. He didn't care about the stolen data or the millions in lost hardware. He moved through the charred wreckage like a man walking through a dream, drawn by a singular magnetic pull toward the central office. When he reached the mahogany desk, he stopped. The air in the room felt thin, charged with an electric current that made the hair on his arms stand up. His gaze fell upon the black silk bundle sitting atop the Ledger of Souls. His hands, usually steady enough to pull a trigger without a tremor, shook as he reached out. He unwound the silk and the diamond-encrusted dragon pendant spilled into his palm. The world went silent. The stones caught the emergency red lights of the warehouse, flashing like droplets of fresh blood. Min-Jae's breath hitched in his throat, a sound that was half sob and half snarl. He remembered the weight of this pendant. He remembered the night he had crushed it beneath his heel, the sound of the diamonds snapping echoing the breaking of Madeline's heart. He had been told she was at the bottom of the river. He had been told there was nothing left of her but the memories that were currently eroding his sanity. But the pendant was clean. It was polished. It was a message. "She's alive," he whispered, the words sounding foreign in his own ears. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden rush of warmth that was instantly choked by a frost so deep it settled in his marrow. She was alive, but she hadn't come to him. She had come to destroy him. His eyes drifted to the security monitors that his hackers had managed to partially recover. A grainy black and white feed played on a loop. A woman in tactical gear, moving with the lethal grace of a high-ranking assassin, looked directly into the camera before the feed cut to static. On her chest, the golden phoenix glowed, the mark of the syndicate that had been trying to decapitate his empire for a decade. The despair that had been his constant companion for 3 months curdled into something far more dangerous. A frantic, obsessive desperation. She was on the enemy side. The soulmate he had discarded had sought refuge in the arms of the one man Min-Jae hated more than himself. He sank into his chair, clutching the pendant so tightly the metal bit into his skin. He was the king of the dragons, but as he stared at the empty space where she had stood, he felt like a beggar. He had his empire, but she had his soul, and she was currently using it to burn his kingdom to the ground. The neon pulse of the velvet abyss throbbed through the floorboards, a rhythmic heartbeat that felt entirely too much like a countdown. The club was a masterpiece of glass and shadow, a sanctuary for Seoul's elite and a known neutral ground for syndicate negotiations. Park Min-Jae moved through the crowded dance floor like a shark through a reef, his presence parting the sea of bodies. He didn't care about the high-end whiskey or the sensory overload of the strobe lights. He was following a lead. A whisper from a captured Phoenix informant that Madeline would be here tonight to oversee a handover of stolen data. His hand rested inside his jacket, fingers grazing the handle of his weapon. Every nerve in his body was on fire, a frantic, desperate hum that told him she was close. He pushed through the heavy double doors of the VIP lounge on the 3rd floor, his guards fanning out behind him. The air here was thicker, scented with expensive cigars and the sharp tang of ozone. At the far end of the room, behind a wall of tinted glass, he saw a silhouette. It was her. She was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, her profile illuminated by the flickering city lights outside. Min-Jae's breath hitched, a raw, jagged sound in the quiet of the lounge. He moved toward her, his heart slamming against his ribs. He didn't care if this was a setup. He didn't care if the Phoenix enforcers were hiding in the vents. He just needed to touch her to see if she was still the woman who had once whispered his name in the dark. "Madeline," he choked out, the name tasting like salt and grief. The chair spun around slowly. Madeline sat back, her legs crossed, wearing a deep red dress that looked like a fresh wound against the dark upholstery. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look afraid. She looked at him with an intense, unreadable stare that made his blood run cold. In her right hand she held a silver revolver, resting it casually on her knee. "You're late, Min-Jae," she said, her voice a cool, melodic blade. "Then again, you always were." The click of a dozen safety catches echoed through the room simultaneously. From the shadows of the private booths, Phoenix soldiers emerged, their red laser sights dancing across Min-Jae's chest. He realized then that he hadn't tracked a lead. He had been led by the nose. The informant hadn't broken under pressure. He had followed Madeline's script perfectly. Min-Jae didn't look at the guns. He only looked at her, at the golden phoenix glowing on her chest. He saw the sharp, perfect styling of her hair and the dark lipstick that made her look like an avenging angel. She wasn't his soulmate anymore. She was the architect of his destruction, and he had walked into her trap with his eyes wide open, driven by a hope that she was currently aiming a silver bullet at. He had come to save her. But as the doors locked behind him, he realized he was the one who needed saving. The heavy double doors of the VIP lounge clicked shut, sealing out the thrum of the club and leaving a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. Min-Jae stood frozen in the center of the room, the rain from his coat dripping onto the polished floor, forming a dark pool around his feet. He looked wrecked, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, a fresh, jagged cut above his eyebrows still weeping crimson. Across from him, Madeline remained perfectly still, her presence commanding the space with a lethal, terrifying elegance. "You look pathetic, Min-Jae," she said, her voice smooth and cold as polished marble. She didn't rise from the leather armchair. Instead she leaned back, the silver revolver resting casually in her lap, her thumb tracing the cylinder. The great Dragon King, reduced to chasing shadows in a basement. Is this what your empire looks like now? Min-Jae took a staggering step forward, ignoring the red laser dots from the Phoenix snipers that immediately centered on his forehead. Madeline, please, he rasped, his voice breaking. You don't understand. The marriage. I was never in control. They drugged me, Maddie. The Vanthorns, my own counsel. They used wolfsbane-laced wine to cloud my mind to make me a puppet. I woke up in a nightmare and you were gone. I've spent every second since then trying to find the men who took you from me. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached toward her, though he didn't dare bridge the distance. The man who had once commanded the underworld with a single look was now begging at the feet of the woman he had discarded. I never stopped looking. I tore this city apart. I've executed every man who had a hand in that night. I love you. I've always loved you. Madeline's expression didn't soften. She watched his despair with an intense, unreadable gaze, her heart a fortress he could no longer breach. You love the memory of the girl who used to wait for you, she countered, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. But that girl drowned in the Han River. You chose your empire, Min-Jae. You chose the throne over the woman who carried your heart. And while you were playing king, I was learning how to be a queen. She stood up slowly, the red silk of her dress rustling like a warning. She stepped toward him, the barrel of her revolver lifting to tilt his chin upward so he had to look into her cold, beautiful eyes. You say you were drugged. You say you're sorry. But sorry doesn't fix the cold of the water or the weight of the silence you left me in. Min-Jae looked up at her, the rain and tears blurring his vision. I'll give it all up, he whispered. The syndicate, the throne, everything. Just come back. I'm not coming back, Madeline said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce fire. I'm moving forward. And if you're in my way, Min-Jae, I'll be the last mistake you ever make. The tension in the VIP lounge was a glass wire stretched to the breaking point. Madeline's revolver was still leveled at Min-Jae's forehead, her finger steady on the trigger, when the world outside the tinted glass exploded. The rhythmic thrum of the club's bass was suddenly punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic staccato of automatic gunfire. Down! Min-Jae roared, his instinct for her safety overriding his own despair. Before the Phoenix guards could even pivot, the skylight shattered in a rain of lethal crystal. Dark figures descended on rappelling lines. Assassins from the Vanthorn Clan, sent to ensure the Dragon Queen remained a memory and the Phoenix Queen became a corpse. The betrayal was complete. The rival bride was cleaning house and she wanted both Madeline and Min-Jae dead in the same room. The lounge turned into a kill zone. Madeline fired her silver revolver, the kickback vibrating through her arm as she dropped a Vanthorn shadow, but she was exposed. A sniper from the mezzanine shifted his aim, centering the red dot directly over Madeline's heart. Min-Jae didn't hesitate. He lunged across the floor, his body a shield of dark wool and desperate love. The crack of the high-velocity round echoed through the small space, but the impact was absorbed by Min-Jae's shoulder. He groaned, a guttural sound of agony as the force of the bullet slammed him into Madeline, sent them both crashing behind the heavy leather armchair. Min, her voice cracked, the ice in her veins finally splintering. He was heavy against her, his blood hot and metallic, soaking into the red silk of her dress. As the Phoenix guards returned fire, pinning the assassins down, Madeline looked at him in horror. He was pale, his breathing shallow, but his hand reached out, fumbling for the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a crumpled medical report, the paper stained with his fresh blood. Look. He gasped, his eyes unfocused. The toxicology, from the night of the gala. Wolfsbane, and neuroinhibitors. They didn't just break us, Maddie. They erased my ability to choose. Madeline stared at the blood-soaked document. The lab results were undeniable. The levels of toxins in his system that night would have left any man a vegetable, yet he had functioned as a hollowed-out puppet. He hadn't just stood there and watched her leave. He had been a prisoner in his own mind. I didn't let you go, he whispered, his head lolling against her shoulder. I died that night too. For the first time in 3 months, Madeline felt the weight of the silver revolver in her hand. She looked at the man who had taken a bullet meant for her, the man who had carried the proof of his innocence through a war zone just for a chance to be heard. The Phoenix Queen was still lethal, but as she gripped Min-Jae's hand, the soft girl from the mezzanine gallery began to scream. The enemy wasn't the man bleeding in her arms. It was the Empire that had tried to bury them both. The gun smoke lingered in the VIP lounge like a toxic fog, mingling with the copper scent of Min-Jae's blood. The Vanthorn assassins lay silent, neutralized by the Phoenix enforcers who now stood guard at the perimeter. But the real battle was happening on the floor behind the leather armchair. Madeline knelt in the wreckage, her hands pressed firmly against the wound in Min-Jae's shoulder. "Stay with me, Min-Jae," she commanded, her voice cracking with a desperation she had sworn never to feel again. "Don't you dare close your eyes." Min-Jae's breathing was a jagged, wet rattle. He looked up at her, his vision swimming, his strength failing. But as he leaned into her, his hand slipped from her shoulder, sliding down the silk of her dress until it brushed against the unmistakable curve of her lower belly. Time seemed to freeze. The chaos of the club, the distant sirens, and the throbbing bass below all faded into a vacuum of silence. Min-Jae's fingers trembled, splaying across the hidden swell of her stomach. His obsidian eyes, once clouded with the haze of blood loss, suddenly cleared with a terrifying primal clarity. "Madeline," he whispered, the word barely a breath. His gaze lifted to hers, searching, pleading, and then widening with a shock so profound it seemed to pull him back from the very edge of death. We're. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The ghost he had been hunting wasn't just his soulmate. She was the vessel for his blood, his legacy, his children. In that heartbeat, the broken man who had been begging for forgiveness vanished. A raw, ancient power surged through him, his feral, protective instincts igniting like a wildfire. Despite the bullet in his shoulder, Min-Jae forced himself upright, his jaw tightening into a mask of lethal intent. He wrapped his good arm around Madeline, pulling her into the hollow of his chest with a possessive strength that brooked no argument. He looked at the Phoenix guards, his enemies only moments ago, with the eyes of an apex predator guarding his den. "Touch her," he rasped, his voice vibrating with a low, guttural warning that made even the hardened mercenaries recoil. "And I will tear this city apart with my bare hands to find your families." He wasn't the Mad King anymore. He was a father who had just realized his entire world was concentrated in the woman in his arms. The blood on his suit was no longer a sign of defeat, but a war paint. He looked at Madeline, his forehead resting against hers, his voice a vow of absolute destruction. "No one touches you. No one touches them. I don't care who I have to kill to keep you safe." Madeline felt the heat of his body, the fierce, terrifying heartbeat of a man who had finally found something worth more than an empire. The war was far from over, but as Min-Jae shielded her from the shadows, she knew the dragon had finally found his fire. The purge of Seoul began not with a whimper, but with the roar of a united front that the underworld never saw coming. Within 48 hours of the attack at the club, the Dragon and Phoenix syndicates, once blood enemies, merged into a single unstoppable shadow. Park Min-Jae, his shoulder bandaged and his eyes burning with a newfound terrifying purpose, stood as the iron fist, while Madeline moved as the surgical blade. Together, they dismantled the Vanthorn Dragon Alliance in a night of systematic retribution that left the city's docks and high-rises stained in the colors of the fallen traitors. The rival bride and the council members who had orchestrated the drugging were not merely removed. They were erased, their empires absorbed into the new order Madeline was building. Min-Jae watched her lead with a pride that bordered on worship. He had been a king who ruled through fear, but Madeline was a queen who ruled through absolute, unyielding power. She didn't just sit on the throne, she redefined what it meant to hold it. The final coronation took place in the same grand ballroom where the betrayal had begun, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The cold blue lights had been replaced by a warm, golden glow that illuminated the thousands of Phoenix and Dragon soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. Madeline stood on the marble dais, wearing a gown of midnight black that swept against the floor, the golden phoenix on her chest glowing with a fierce internal light. She was no longer a secret, no longer a servant to his whims, and no longer a victim of his mistakes. Min-Jae stepped forward not to take the crown but to present it. In front of the gathered leaders of the underworld, the most feared man in Asia knelt at Madeline's feet. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the pulse at her wrist, and looked up at her with a devotion that silenced the room. I traded my soul for a crown once, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. I will not make that mistake again. My life, my sword, and my loyalty belong to the Queen of the Phoenix. From this day forth we are one. He placed the crown upon her head, and a deafening roar of "Long live the Queen" shook the very foundations of the Lotte World Tower. Madeline looked out over her new empire, her hand resting over her heart, and the secret heirs growing beneath it. Beside her, Min-Jae rose, his hand finding the small of her back, a silent promise of protection that would never be broken again. The girl who had been discarded in the shadows was gone. The soulmate who had been left for dead was dead no more. As the rain continued to wash over the neon streets of Seoul, a new era began. The dragon had found his mate, and the phoenix had found her throne. Together they weren't just a syndicate. They were a legacy forged in betrayal and reborn in blood. They had found their way back to each other against all odds, and this time the world would burn before they were ever parted again.